Our worship series on the Lord's Prayer continues this week with the petition, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." And so we read two lessons from the Scriptures. The first is from the epistle of James. James is offering wisdom to the church, and in our passage today is focused specifically on the temptations that come to us and the need for our resistance to those temptations. Hear the word of God. James says, "Blessed is anyone who endures temptation. Such a one has stood the test and will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. No one, when tempted, should say, 'I am being tempted by God.' For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself tempts no one. But one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. And then when that desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And that sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. Do not be deceived, my beloved." Our epistle lesson for today. Our gospel reading is from the Gospel according to Luke. It's towards the end of Jesus' life. Luke's version of the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane and the instructions that Jesus gives to his disciples as he's praying on the Mount of Olives. Those instructions fit with our theme and the prayer that we make, "Lead us not into temptation." From Luke chapter 22, starting at verse 39, hear the word of God. Jesus came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down, and prayed, "Father, if you were willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. When he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. When Jesus gives the disciples an example of the prayer to pray, one of the petitions that's included in that prayer is, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." And interestingly, both at the beginning and the end of this scene in Luke's gospel, this very dramatic scene, Jesus gives the instructions to his disciples. In Luke's gospel, it's the last instructions he gives. Pray that you may not come into the time of trial, or you could translate, pray that you may not come into temptation. Lead us not into temptation, into the time of trial. It's the hardest petition in the Lord's Prayer to understand, I think. Most of us don't try. We figure we've crested the hill, the roller coaster is going down, we're soon coming into the station, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, whatever that means. It's good for us to think about whatever that means, because it matters enough to Jesus to tell us to pray for that. To tell the disciples, his closest followers, the moment before he's arrested, to pray like that. Lead us not into temptation. So there are a couple things to clear up, understanding-wise, about this that really, I think, might help us when we think about and pray this petition and prayer. One is that unfortunate translation that says, lead us not into temptation. Right? Lead us not, like God was going to lead us and take us by the hand and say, here you go, here's the chocolate cake in the fridge. Look at it, look at it, look at it, look at it. Okay. Or more seriously, that those situations and challenges that come into our lives that are trials are things that God designs for us, leads us to, makes us endure. And it's easy to think about whether at the root of this is some picture of a mean God, an authoritarian figure who's running us through some sort of a game or something like that. Lead us not. And I want to preserve the sovereignty of God here to say God does engineer circumstances, I believe, and God does understand the full sway of all of the things that we do and will do. But I think probably what's the sense of that petition as it translates from the Aramaic that Jesus spoke it into the Greek in which it was recorded in the Gospel, and into the English that the King James translators did, and all the generations hence that have followed. It's probably something more like, don't let us be led to that. Don't allow the circumstances to happen in which we will find ourselves tried, tempted, challenged. It's a prayer essentially for protection, not an indictment of God who makes challenges for us. That's one thing to say. The other thing to say is that the same word sometimes gets translated trial and sometimes temptation. In this translation that we have in the Pew Bible, there is an alternate version. You can either translate it time of trial or into temptation. Temptation and trial. They sound like two wildly different things to us, right? Temptation is like that chocolate cake in the fridge, right? Or whatever your particular little vices that you indulge, or big vice that you indulge. Temptation, the example of something that would lure us, right? It would lure us into its spiritual power by enticing us and captivating our attention. And when we indulge that, we get closer and closer to actually executing the act that we're trying to resist. Y'all know what I'm talking about? If you do, say amen. Oh, that's right, church. Temptation. It's easy for us to diminish temptation, to call it something silly, because it scares us. And each of us probably, if we're honest with ourselves, knows how susceptible we are, how fragile we are, how vulnerable we are when tempted. Most of us aren't really that strong. Temptation. Or trial. Trial would be perhaps the more helpful way of getting at it. A trial is a situation that you experience. It's a test, right? A situation that you experience that reveals what the truth is. And if it's a challenging experience, a trial, right? That's what we're used to thinking of, right? You have a trial in court, you find out whether the person is guilty or innocent. You try the case, and it resolves with either a verdict this way or a verdict that way. A clinical trial for a drug reveals whether the drug is useful or not useful, whether there are benefits, whether there are adverse indications, and so forth and so forth. Right? A trial. You try it, and you test it, and you see what's there. Circumstances that happen to us, trials that we undergo, situations that we face, reveal what the status of our faith is, whether we're strong, where we're vulnerable, whether we actually trust this word about God's rule in the world, or whether that's just, silly language for us. Because when you get right in the middle of the circumstances and you cry out, then you know at least that you trust the one who you're crying to. Trial. Same word, the testing of circumstances and the circumstances that are a trial that might be particularly dangerous. Both of those are part of this petition. One final thing to say is that lead us not into temptation is not different from or unrelated to deliver us from evil. If you try to make those two utterly different things, then you might go a little crazy. What happens if you think of both of them as one as a restatement of the essence of the other? Don't lead us into the situation in which we are tested and tried by circumstances that are stronger than us. Rather, deliver us, save us from evil. Jesus wants us to be prepared. To be prepared. It's the last of 6 petitions in the Lord's Prayer. We'll have a sermon next week because, that's what preachers do. And it's on the Lord's Prayer, but this is the last petition. The last thing we're asking for. Jesus crafts the prayer so that we end this prayer, this model prayer, this typical prayer, this habitual prayer, perhaps it is, in text. So that always we are praying, and praying at the end of the prayer for protection against the circumstances that are trying for us, that are testing for us, that we are not strong enough to endure on our own. We are in a constant place of need in our mature living as followers of Jesus. And so Jesus knows that we are in a constant state of needing strength. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us. You know, part of our problem is that we underestimate evil. We don't think of evil as evil. We don't think of sin as sin. Some years ago, a psychologist, Carl Menninger, psychiatrist I guess he was, wrote a book called Whatever Became of Sin. And he was remarking about the move in our culture towards a more therapeutic perspective on the human experience, and that in a way that we've lost some of the language that describes the spiritual reality of sin as rebellion against God and complicity with evil. Whatever became of sin? Well, part of it is that there's not a common understanding of what's right and what's wrong in our culture. Another part of it is that those of us who have a good sense of what's right and what's wrong don't want to be seen as judgmental, so we don't use that word sin. We soft pedal it. We don't call things evil. Unless we're flaming somebody on Facebook. then you're okay to do that. So, we don't have that vocabulary. We don't think about evil and sin and the power that it has to snag us. We had 3 boys in our home throughout their teenage years. I was astounded at their capacity to underestimate the danger in the circumstances in which they habitually flirted and to overestimate their power to sail right through as if there was not going to be a problem in the world. And one of our sons especially, but all of them at some point, but one especially, he would just get tagged every single time. He couldn't get away with a thing. Underestimating what sin does because it scares us. Well, let's be sober about this now. Together, what if we just promise ourselves first and each other also? We are not going to underestimate the power of evil. And so we will be especially careful. Especially careful not to go even towards it. That passage from James, please, please, please look at it again. He's talking about how it is that when temptation hits us, it's not God making us sin. It's something that's welling up within us, that's attracting us to something that's wrong, and instead of turning aside, we indulge that. We're like my teenage sons who say, "Yeah, you know, don't be so dramatic, Pops. Yeah, that's a problem for other people. It's not going to be a problem for me." Oh. Immune to human experience. Congratulations. Well, you're not either, and I'm not either. And we oughtn't have to go again and again and again into those situations in which we just get zapped one more time by consequences that we should have known were coming. For evil that is obvious if we're looking at our world with spiritual eyes, as Jesus invites us to do and instructs us to do and asks us to pray about. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Jesus knows. He knows that evil and the power of sin in the world and the tempter, the one who would turn us aside, the father of lies, he knows exactly how dangerous that is. It doesn't want that for people he loves like you. We are not strong enough to face evil and defeat it on our own. Thanks be to God, we don't have to. But our faithful living should always understand that evil is abroad in our world. We should not be surprised by it. We should expect it. And we certainly shouldn't be complicit with it. No, God has handled the problem of evil. God has broken the back of evil. Unfortunately, until that kingdom is consummated on earth, we who live human lives will always be contending with it. But we contend on the side of the victor in the struggle. If we pray the Lord's Prayer meaningfully, we reckon with that power and we claim God's greater power to strengthen us, to protect us, to lead us not anywhere near that test, but rather to deliver us, to save us from the power that would take us from God's hand. So let us pray when we pray. And let us not pray one thing and do the other thing. Now let's trust that our wise and loving God knows what's best and has the power to save us. In the name of the Father,